Welcome to the Patio Pioneering Podcast, where we're searching for clear thinking in complex agriculture. As we've talked over the last few podcasts, swine nutrition has become increasingly precise over the last few decades, whether they're talking about formulations or models, ingredient analytics or data systems. But pigs still actually need to get fed. And sometimes the biggest performance differences do not happen on the spreadsheets. They happen somewhere between the nutritional model and what we nutritionists try and perfect, the feeding system, and actually what happens inside the barn. Today I'm joined with Dr. Hyatt Frobose. Hyatt and I both earned our Ph.D. at Kansas State University, and although we're separated by generations, we share a common passion on making sure that we translate good nutrition into good feeding. The other thing that Hyatt and I share is we're both natives of the Eastern Corn Belt. And before we recorded, we talked about some of the commonalities we have here in the Eastern Corn Belt. So Hyatt, welcome to the patio.
Thanks for having me, Jim. And I think that introduction sums up a lot of our existence. It's interesting for me to be on the side of the table of equipment and implementation of a lot of the nutritional principles that we know and try to execute in the barn, right?
Mm-hmm. We're going to jump right into it, Hyatt. 11 years ago, you surprised a lot of people in swine nutrition when you chose a role with a swine feed equipment company instead of a traditional swine nutritionist role. Can you walk through that decision with me?
Yeah. Trying to think of how to go about this, but it was a tough decision at the time. I was fortunate to have a few different opportunities, and they spanned everything from traditional production nutritionist role to academia. But I had some exposure with Giga, makers of Gestalt, during my PhD research, which was pretty sow focused. And I'll be completely honest, they were not really even on my radar screen initially as an opportunity. But one of the guys that I worked with from Giga put together, basically said we might be able to do something. And while I was kind of considering several other good options, Giga put together an offer, and it was a combination of things that kind of catalyzed me going that way. And at the time, I was pretty skeptical. I don't know, I shouldn't say skeptical, but I was nervous. That's probably a better way to discuss it, because I knew the product. I had used the lactation feeder that Gestalt had for part of my PhD research, so I was pretty comfortable as a user of the product. But the company was also getting into electronic sow feeding and pen gestation, which Canada passed the mandate to go to that in 2014. And so I'm sitting here in spring of 2015 with a few offers on my plate and my PhD dissertation planned for late summer of that year. And I think what part of it boiled down to for me was I've joked about this a few times over the years, but I got a little tired of sitting around the swine team meeting with everybody around the table, professors and grad students, and we'd be getting into some piss and match about how many points of phytase we needed to move to be right on this formulation. And so often it seemed like whenever I was out in the barn or doing field research, those were so far from the big, I guess the big rocks that needed fixed in real production, right? And one of my colleagues at Giga always used the example of we can sit behind a spreadsheet and formulate all we want, but if we're feeding the pigs with a scoop shovel, that doesn't really get the job done, right? And obviously most barns are a ways away from that at this point, but I think there is still a lot of truth of, at the end of the day, our job is to try to get the right diet to the right pig at the right time. And in many cases, what we want to do is impossible to do and implement in the barn. And I like what Gestalt was doing. I was unsure of what they could become, but I guess the way I rationalized it in my brain at the time was that I was like, hey, I know that with this job, I'm going to be in a lot of barns. I'm going to get to see and meet a lot of people and learn a lot of things from customers or prospects. And if in 2 years this doesn't really work out, if I give them a fair shot and it's not going somewhere, as a PhD trained nutritionist, I figured there were probably some other opportunities that would pop up that I could probably bring some new value to. So that was my rationalization in my brain is like, hey, this is only 2 years, and if this isn't my career for 20 years or whatever, then so be it. And the funny thing is, I'm still sitting here 11 years later, and so I use that now when I'm hiring people and we're talking to young people I'm trying to mentor, or they've asked or not asked for advice. But I try to remind them that sometimes it seems like, you're committing to a life with one company. And I don't think that's really the case. I think you've got to have that kind of like constant learning type of mindset, no matter what, whether you're looking at where you go for your master's or your Ph.D. or what first job you take. Hindsight's 2020, and you kind of, I don't know that we're really separated by multiple generations, maybe one, Jim.
Yes.
You're not quite that old, but at the end of the day, I think it's easier to look back with hindsight and realize that it's a very big step of what your first job's going to be, but probably in most people's careers, you're going to make multiple moves. And it's one of the things that I tell young people that I am hoping to get to work with or will work with me on my team, is that I think me expecting somebody to join Giga and then retire with Giga is just, irrational, right? That's, if it happens, great, but that's probably, for most people, that's not how life is going to work out, and so I try to tell everybody that is coming on board or looking to come on board with us, is like, my goal is to continue to develop skills for you so that when you make the next move in your career, you feel like the time you spent at Giga helped build you as a person. And I've had several people who have, for lack of a better term, been poached or been recruited away from us because somebody else saw them as valuable to take a next step up. And I hate that because I don't want to lose them usually. But I also sometimes have to think about it as like, that's a little bit of flattery too. If we're identifying the right people and we're developing them, and other companies are finding ways to pay them more or give them a better, situation, at the end of the day, that's flattery. So there's still a bit of teacher mentor in me in that respect, that it helps me rationalize some of those situations as you're a team leader and trying to build a good culture in a company, right?
You've thrown out a lot of interesting words in that answer. I mean, you threw out nervous, you threw out expectation, you threw out flattery, you even threw out frustration when you were talking about points of vitae. Trey Kellner and I talked about that a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
Is your position that it's okay if somebody leaves? Is that something you learned, or is that something that's innate in you?
I don't know if I've ever had that question before. I don't know that I'd say it's okay, because when somebody leaves, I think the question, it depends how they leave.
Well, that's true.
That's important, right? I mean, because
let's premise it as somebody leaves and betters their career.
Yeah, I have to embrace that. I think that's something that I have to consider a victory for that person, and that needs to supersede the short-term pain that it might create for me and my team. But it keeps you, I think, because if you're not doing that, you're capping progress. You're capping, you're putting a dimmer switch on everybody's capabilities. And so it keeps, I guess it makes the HR department or the guy, it makes them work harder if that's happening. But I'd much rather have that than a bunch of do nothing yes men that aren't going anywhere. Like I really hate to hear that when occasionally I hear that other people have left a company because they feel like they'd reached their ceiling and there was no pathway for improvement or and I can appreciate as an administrator, you can't always move everybody up all the time because there may not be a chair that fits that. But at the same token, like I've got some really good people on my team right now that I would love to create a pathway for advancement, but I won't be able to do that on all of them. That's just realistic. And if they can move up into a higher role on some other company's team and bring value, that's going to be good for me. They're still going to look back on a great experience with Gestal and Giga, and probably from a new backyard still be allies, right? Like I've seen that for some of the people that have left, they remain good allies of what we do, and they bring an unbiased perspective to those companies or to their customers about what it's like to use Just Sol equipment, or to, how it can be successful in the field without necessarily wearing the brand that they know, hey, you're getting paid to say this. So it's kind of like, we have a lot of our equipment in universities, and I don't think Giga makes a ton of money on our university projects. Let's just put it that way, right? Like, I mean, they take a lot of effort. They make me sometimes want to strangle IT departments. Most of the time, they're all pain in the necks. But at the end of the day, like it's about advertising too, right? Like that hands-on experience, that familiarity with the technology for people that are in an educational stage of their development. They're going to go out into the field, or some of them are, and they're going to hopefully run into that equipment and be able to immediately utilize it or help their companies utilize it. Or they may later on at least have a level of comfort that adopting new technologies isn't completely foreign to them. And I've seen that. It's kind of you got to have some long investment on that, because it may not pay dividends right away. But there's been a lot of times where I've had people talk to me about the fact that they were exposed to our equipment at Kansas State or at South Dakota State or at Purdue, and I see that payback because it ultimately is helping our equipment become more familiar and comfortable in the industry to be utilized effectively. So yeah, that's a connectedness to that question, I think.
You used the word ally in those former employees that bettered themselves with a different career move. That's a very mature position. Is that something that was innate in you? Have you always had that feeling that somebody can better themselves and it's not at your expense?
I guess so. I don't know that I've spent a lot of time thinking about it until you asked that question. Your deep thoughts here. It's good. But yeah, I think it's probably the educator that's down deep in me somewhere that, I told you I considered academia positions, and, I think you have to have that mentality. I coached livestock judging teams. I coached meats judging teams when I lived in Australia. And there's just something I used to, when I was on those teams, obviously I'm all for winning and the competitive rush of doing well yourself, but there's something so much more satisfying in seeing a team succeed that you mentor. You're living vicariously through them. But I've brought that type of mentality to my team at Giga, and it's probably helped us develop good culture and to have a camaraderie that is not competitive within ourselves. And I'd say it probably goes hand in hand with that, right? Like all those people, those students that I worked with or developed at the university level, you were trying to better them in their life skills. So it probably is just a carryover effect of that, as some of the coaching experience I had, younger in life. So I don't know. That's probably the way it's been developed in me to do that in my career position now too.
Well, that has to be a fun position for you to be in, to be able to be a coach, not just a boss.
I think so. Sometimes you got to be a boss too, and that's the hard part, right? Is like, how to delineate that. Like I think it comes down to, making sure that you're transparent. I think transparency is really key within a team. I mean, I'm exposed to some high level decisions within our company just because of the position I'm in now. And I have to sometimes recognize whether this needs to be shared with everybody throughout my team. But for the most part, I try really hard to be as transparent as possible with everybody, from our part-time people working in the warehouse to our full-time, colleagues that are out being representatives or technicians and stuff. And I just feel like that level of transparency trickles down. It's kind of a lead by example, and everybody it helps everybody understand the roles that each of us need to play. Like I'm doing less frontline in barn work than I used to. But one of the things that I'm trying to tell my team, like, hey, I need this field knowledge, these observations from you, because I've got to be the ambassador for our team going back to our headquarters to guide R&D on where they need to be focusing their priorities, or guide operations on how much safety stock we need to have, or how quick our turnaround needs to be on these projects. Like, you guys have got to give me that pulse, and I've got to feed that. And it takes time for me to deliver that message. And I don't always like the time commitment, because I'd much rather, I tell a lot of my territory reps that I'm jealous of them, because when I started, I was in their role, and I still am jealous of them, because I hate that I don't get to get in the barn as much as I used to. I really hate that. But I also recognize today that when I'm in a barn all day and I get out and I look at my phone, it's just like, oh God, this is going to be bad. Just people have been waiting on decisions or information they needed faster than an 8-hour block in a farm will take. So I've got to balance that, but I also think it is really important to remain a certain level of groundedness to how are your customers interacting with your product, and what our customer needs. And if we get too detached from that, that's one of the big reasons why I think our electronic feeding systems have been successful in this industry, is we've got a level of production knowledge, and our owners are swine producers, and that has really helped us not just dream up things that are cool on an engineer's workbench, but actually work in a barn. And as we grow, we've got to maintain that and kind of keep that, because that's been our point of differentiation. There's a lot of companies that have come before us that have made electronic sow feeders, right? But what's been our secret sauce to be successful, I think that groundedness in production is part of it. I think customer service is part of it. And I think some of the type of viewpoints that I bring versus maybe what an engineer would bring, or somebody that is traditional equipment mindset would bring, it doesn't always land the right way with the customer. And we try to bring more of a slat level experience type of perspective that seems to lead to a higher percentage success rate.
I like your discussion when you're talking about fighting over the number of points of phosphorus release with phytase. And I think it is an illustration of how we as nutritionists want to be perfect. We use a spreadsheet. We get everything perfect on the spreadsheet. But in practicality, what happens in the farm, do the sows have feed? Is it the right feed? No, but they got feed. How are you able to work with your engineering team, your sales team, and overcome those drive for perfection and just be like, the sows got feed, we won today because of them getting fed?
Yeah. I think that it is a knife's edge that we've got to kind of always stay, or a road, you got to stay between the rumble strips, because as a technology company, it's our obligation to continue to develop things and to create new products or new adaptations that are better. But it's also a tendency for technology companies, mine and aside, to sometimes go too far down extra bells and whistles that are not really at the core purpose of what the product is being asked to do. And I've seen that derail other companies, because if those bells and whistles can cause problems that keep sows from getting fed, nobody cares, because it ultimately puts a bad taste in everybody's mouth, because then we got, dumpster fire we're dealing with. So I think there's at some point somebody told me that there's elegance and simplicity. And I think that's a really true statement, and it applies to our equipment a lot, that we need to hear and listen to customer feedback about what features would be interesting, but we got a long list of things that people would like to have, but that may not necessarily be what most of the customers want, or what pencils want from a payback potential, right? You can make a product way too expensive by adding too many premium options too. And so keeping that finger on the pulse and understanding what's going to drive real business is something that is a constant rebalancing effort. because the R&D team's job is to develop new stuff. But I have conversations with them all the time. I feel like depending on which room I'm in, I've got to play a different side of it, right? And when I'm with our R&D team and our board of directors meetings, I'm being that bump on a log, grumpy guy that's like, why are you spending time on this, right? Like that's going nowhere. And you've spent how many tens of thousands of dollars on this? Like, I don't see a path to market for this. But then on other times, I'm talking to the customers that are asking for new things or new capabilities or saying that some other brand has this. And then I've got to go back to the headquarters and say, well, I know I said that this was garbage and this was garbage, but I do need this. So I'm constantly like talking out of both sides of my mouth, and it is a hard position to be in because I've got to try not to be the boy that cried wolf. And ultimately it is my job to bring these products to market. And so I like to operate on the if you talk about a product development spectrum, there's everything from idea to, release and application. I really like existing in application. The type of research that I do, that I did throughout grad school and stuff, is mostly I would call applied research. And it's really important to differentiate that from product development. And sometimes in my company, we call all of it research or R&D, and I guess technically it is, but there's a very big difference between application research and new product development. And sometimes wires get crossed at different levels of the company on which one of those is more important, or where should money be spent or resources dedicated. And I'm pretty biased towards the application side, but sometimes I am asking those guys to come up with some new good things or make something we have better. It's a push-pull.
So to get that information from the Slats, you have to allow your team to have interactions with your customers and prospects that are not part of the sales process.
Yeah.
How do you balance allowing your salesman, hey, I spent 2 days at this farm, I didn't do anything with the sales process, with, hey, we needed that information?
Well, first of all, I just consider it part of continuing education, right? So some team members are better at seeking that out themselves than others. Some of them need a nudge in that direction. And some of them are in need of that more than others, right? If I've got somebody that spent 8 years and managed sow farms, it doesn't mean that they could use a refresher every once in a while, but they know how to breed a sow, right? But occasionally I'm going to have somebody that maybe comes in with a lot more business experience, or maybe they come from the equipment world but don't have a ton of slat level experience. Those ones, I think it's more important to just get them, take a deep dive in that for a while and feel that, because if you don't really know how your product's going to be utilized in the field, it's pretty hard to be a good salesman, in my opinion. So I don't know if I would call this my secret sauce or anything, but I would say that one of the things that our company does differently than most companies that I see, and I think this includes nutrition and includes pharmaceuticals and genetics even, all of my sales reps, I actually call them territory reps because they have a designated region, which I know is normal, but their role and responsibilities include sales and customer support. And not every company does that. Bigger companies in particular start to segregate those roles and responsibilities. And I admit that it is difficult to maintain and difficult to find people that can do both of those things well. But part of the reason that I do it is because that's one of the things that attracted me to Jestal at first. I was the only guy at the time, but I had to do sales and customer support, right? Like I was doing all of it, and I found that extremely rewarding. I felt like it was a really good balance, because at the end of the day, I don't know that I would like to be in a sow farm all day, every day, and just going and hooking stuff up or problem solving stuff all the time. I like the customer interactions, the going to a trade show, talking to people. I like to be home with my wife and kids sometimes too. So that balance of behind the desk work and in the field work is, I think, good for a lot of people's work-life balance and to challenge them. But I also recognize that they need to have the understanding of how the product works and maybe what are the most likely failure points? What are the most likely pitfalls that can go? Because when we're talking about a new project with a customer, it is so much more meaningful to be talking to that person when you've got firsthand experience with the product and have been in a barn last week, right? So it's a balance, because at the end of the day, most of those people are being compensated off of results, and spending too much time in customer support may not be their primary role. But I think it is a really pivotal part of how our team has been successful. And so I've tried to continue to embrace that philosophy as we grow, while also putting enough backstops behind it. Like, we have full-time technicians. We have 2 full-time technicians. I'm sitting at one of them's desk who are bilingual, right? We've got a lot of team members a lot of customers and barns that are, at times fully only Spanish speaking. And so if I've got an English speaking representative that can't speak Spanish, me asking them to go do training and support sometimes can be a legitimate shortcoming. So we try to reinforce that with a Spanish speaking technician or replace that, so, I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but I will say that is something that we've had a lot of internal discussions about, because outside of my region, which is North America, in the rest of the globe, our company doesn't operate that way. We have dedicated salespeople, we have dedicated service people, and that works for them. For whatever reason, mostly probably my own bias, the dual role territory reps has worked for us, especially in the U.S. market. And I'm really hesitant to forego that, because I think it ultimately leads to better customer experience.
Well, I like the way that you sum that up with a better customer experience, because if they don't have a good experience, there's always somebody else that's got another sow feeder that they could put in.
Exactly. And in the U.S. industry, which is what, you and I are most familiar with, in 2026, we could probably sit down and write down a list, and it'd be shorter than 50 people of the real decision makers for 90% of the sows in the U.S. You might even argue it's 25, right? So at the end of the day, there is zero tolerance for failure. If we put our equipment in and somebody makes a big CapEx investment in our premium technology, and it fails, they are probably in charge of quite a few other sow farms that they are not going to be putting our equipment in. And so, does that mean that there aren't hiccups and things that can go wrong? But how they have that customer experience is directly related to the next sale. And so, by keeping those interlinked in my staff, I think it leads to a higher likelihood of a good customer experience that inevitably will lead to more sales. And in some other parts of the world where there are a lot more small to medium size producers that are still independent, maybe we could use France as an example, or Ontario is a little bit like that too. Maybe the recipe is a little bit different, right? You need to work with local suppliers and things, and that can still be a really successful model too. But here in the U.S., with the vast majority of the customers that fit the profile of us being able to help them, I think that's the key to our success.
I'm going to shift just a little bit on you. Your training as a swine nutritionist leads you and I down a path, and it leads us into a silo. I think you're at an interesting position where you're able to tear down a couple silos between the nutrition and feeding, and your team working together. Have you seen some of the silos fall where the nutritionists and the production teams are working together differently?
Hopefully. I mean, I think yes. I think it's still a big work in progress. I mean, probably the best juncture where I feel this regularly. So one of the key responsibilities that I've maintained, even as my company's grown, is I taught myself AutoCAD, because I learned early on that our electronics can only be successful if they're set up the right way, right? Like particularly pen gestation. If we put a good ESF in the wrong place, or with the wrong water positions, or the wrong flooring, or overstock it, whatever, it could still fail. So I taught myself AutoCAD quite a few years ago, and I've used that to build more experience and to help customers visualize how we're going to put these feeders in gestation and lactation and GDU, which are kind of in finishing. But it's led to a lot of discussions with maybe not necessarily production teams, but often production teams, but also the facilities teams, which is another silo, right? The guys working on buildings and facilities and repair and maintenance, working with those guys. There's a lot of times where I'm putting my nutrition hat on and saying, hey, guys, like, even if you don't put in gestol feeders, you need to be thinking about this because, a great example is whether or not to do 2 feed lines. Like right now, that is a pretty trendy conversation. I'd say it's still in its infancy, maybe is the best way to describe it. But there's more and more data from the science and the nutrition side that would justify the investment in a second feed line. Sometimes it can be enhanced by a precision feeder below it, and sometimes it may be sufficient just to have an A or B option for pens of sows or certain lactating females and things. I feel like it's my obligation as a nutritionist to bring some of those feed system infrastructure conversations to the facilities people, because this is nothing against them, but they're usually the next building they're trying to build is way too expensive. It's way more expensive than the last time. So it's already like, God, how do we justify these extra costs? But their blueprint is, well, we did this farm a year ago and everything's going pretty good there. I haven't heard any major complaints. So, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's going to take a lot more time to reinvent the wheel than to cookie cutter that. Right. But sometimes that can get us into this consistent trend of just not improving the capabilities of our farms, because I think it's back to silos, and rarely, not never, but rarely are the nutritionists really getting pulled into those design conversations. The nutritionists get pulled in after everything's been decided, or maybe just as a final check mark to say, can you work with this? And if it can be brought in early enough in the conversation, the nutritionist can say, well, yeah, if I could apply a late gestation diet to these sows, I could probably pay for that second bin and second feed line based on the cost you've showed me in 3 years. Then everybody could sit there and decide if that's a quick enough payback or not. But so often there's just so many pieces moving on a new build or a remodel, and there's usually it's time sensitive. We're doing it because we had a depop, or because we finally got this barn permitted and now we got to go because we're 6 months behind. So people got to cut corners somewhere, and sometimes it's cost cutting. Sometimes it's just we can't get too creative because we don't have time. And I found that that's the majority of the situations, not the minority. The minority of the ones are the ones where you can really kind of say, hey, in an ideal world, what would we do? But it is nice I always try to bring that when somebody pulls me into the equation on layouts, which is hopefully early enough to have these conversations. Because if we can lay out an ideal, then it's easy to work backwards from that and say, all right, well, because of this factor, we can't do that. Because of this factor, we can't do that. But we can, if we have that goal of like, what is ideal, then we can all know what we're foregoing by making some concessions, because especially in remodels, which I think our industry is likely to have more remodels than new construction sow farms for the foreseeable future, just with a relatively mature market and a lot of facilities that have good bones but have interior equipment that might need changed out, or welfare regulations or things that change it. But a lot of those remodels, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You've got to decide what are the compromises you're willing to make. And one of the things that I've really seen in this sow farm construction conversations is, I think in 2026, the thing that is perhaps most important when you're making this big of an investment is you need to have versatility, right? The farm needs to be somewhat flexible, right? Like, I don't think very many people are in the U.S. are tearing out old, worn out, rusted out crates and going in and putting 100% new gestation crates in, right? It's just not a very flexible decision. And if you're going to spend all that money on steel in 2026, you need to be mentally prepared that there may be something like Prop 12 that comes along that forces you to change that before that steel has paid itself off. I think that's a fairly high likelihood. And so this is what really boils down in a lot of people's decision-making tree is, I don't want to change more than I have to, but can I have some flexibility? Another example is like concrete walls in pens. Like, it's not real common in the US, but for example, in Canada, there's still a lot of barns that use a lot of concrete walls. And like, I always tell them, like, you better be happy where you've got those walls because they're a pain to cut out. You know, if you put steel penning in there or even plastic penning, at least you can unbolt it from the floor and move it if you need to. But there's places in the world that love their concrete. And it's like, you better be happy with that decision. You better make sure you measure twice, cut once, because it's going to be a pain pulling that out.
One of the things that we nutritionists do a lot is it would be nice. 2 feed lines, electronic sow feeder. You're in a position where you can help a farm do it would be nice.
Yes. And I try. I mean, this is where I've got to walk the fine line of, obviously I'm wearing a brand. I am selling. And so, you know, I usually don't need to state that, but everybody knows that going in. So there's that, there's a certain level of exposing people to what opportunities they have while also not coming in with the hard sell. Because, and I think when I get speaking opportunities, this is something that I really try to prioritize is, yes, we have a brand that I feel comfortable we could provide this solution, but in most cases, there are other brands that could also execute the same thing. And that's hard probably to do, but I think it's so important to maintain credibility as a scientist, because everybody knows that I'm working for Gestalt. I mean, everybody knows that at the end of the day, I'm paid for, we sell more feeders, I get more money. Like that's, it doesn't need to be. So coming in with the heavy-handed Gestalt's better, it's BS at the end. There are a lot of other electronic feeding companies that have good quality products. To me, I think our secret sauce is how we implement them, how we configure them with customers, how we help them make an optimized decision. I think optimization is really important, right? It's not about having all the bells and whistles. It's about having the right tools for your barn. And I was just down in Mexico last week, and I work with our Mexico colleagues, and there are some products that we sell in the U.S. that probably don't fit most Mexican producers just based on some limitations that their fundamental industry has. Like, they don't have really reliable electricity in some places. Kind of hard to be successful with an electronic feeder if you don't have electricity. So there is some recognition of, hey, this is not the right product for this customer. And when you can help customers through that, and you can show them that we're not here just to make a buck, like this is about a long-term relationship, not a short-term sale. I think that ultimately is good business. And you've seen that in your career too, right? Like I think you earn a lot more trust and business relationships long-term by having that versus just trying to make a quick buck. And I have the benefit of 11 years of doing this now, that I've gotten the opportunity to now tear out some other electronic systems or some stanchions, for example, from barns that I missed the opportunity on in 2015, 2016, 2017. Maybe we were too new on the market, or we weren't a proven technology. In the last couple of years, we've went and replaced some of those. And that's been really cool, because at the time I thought, man, that was a missed opportunity. I lost that. But being in it 10 years, some of those have worn out. And I've gotten a second shot at it. And it's like, all right, well, that shows me that we got to stay the course. You got to, have, if you can take that long-term position, it'll pay dividends. And I can appreciate now more where a lot of people in your chair, older, wiser guys that have been in the industry longer, I understand a little bit more about the value of staying power, of people staying with companies for a long time, about brands that have stayed in the market for a long time. It's hard. I've seen some other companies that are trying to do what we do come and go from the U.S. market, basically. And I always try to use that as a reminder for my team that, hey, we could have the stuff that gets ripped out and is piled back behind the barn, just like some of our predecessors have. And so like, we got to recognize that you're not far off from that if you start not caring about your customers, not caring about long-term support, maintenance, those kind of things. Cause, I've seen too many electronic companies get in that position, and I don't want to be in that situation. I don't want Jestall to be in that situation. So, is it biased? I mean, yeah, you're obviously trying to protect your own skin on it to some extent. But at the end of the day, I think those customers want that stuff to work too. They don't want to have to rip it out. They want it to last. Yeah, that's been kind of one of the fun things here. I'm now 10, 11 years in, right? I've got some barns that have had our stuff now for long enough to where like we are having those conversations that people would ask me in 2016, well, how long would your ESF feeder going to last? And I'm like, well, we just released it in 2014. So I honestly can't answer that question. Like, I just had to say, like, I hope that we tried to build it so that it will last that. But does that mean that we don't have some stuff that needs repaired and replaced after 10 years? No. But I'm really proud of the fact that we don't have a bunch of equipment that's been ripped out. Like I had a barn in Missouri last year that was a 3,000 sow farm that was built in 2016, and they doubled that farm in 2025. And it doesn't mean that it's been all rainbows and unicorns with that farm. You know, we've had things that we've done to maintain that relationship, but when they doubled that farm, they didn't tear out any of the old electronic equipment. They added more of our equipment in the new barn, and they just kept rolling with the stuff they had. And I was like, man, that is as powerful of a testimonial as I've gotten, because they didn't feel like it was, even though they have construction crews there and they have the barn empty, like they could have probably, it wouldn't have been a bad time to put new stuff in. And they felt like, hey, we've got enough life left in this equipment that we're not forced to do that right now. And I was just like, man, that's cool. And it's fun to be able to tell that story because it means we're doing something right. I mean, I think most producers, myself included, would like stuff to last forever.
Of course.
Right? Like it needs to last for 50 years. And it's probably not realistic, but you know, the fact that it's meeting some of my early customers' expectations, because we've made improvements since then, right? Like the version they bought in 2016 is not the version we have in 2026. So the fact that the 2016 version is still kicking, makes me feel pretty good about where we're at now, even though I see under the hood and I know all the things that we need to keep working on. Like, it's still a long list of things we need to do better. But that's rewarding in my chair to see customers that when they're facing down the barrel of something like that, they're doubling down, right?
You illustrated with your comment about the barn that came back to you 10 years later is a concept of it's okay to be second because you'll be number one when number one screws up. That's a tough place to be as a sales manager to say, oh, it's okay we didn't sell. No, it's not. How do you mentor a salesman that we're number two, it's going to come to us?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. First of all, I think there's an appropriate delineation here too. One thing that I've learned is there's some sales you don't want to win. There are some customers that are not good customers. And this is a joint relationship when you go into something. I mean, with our equipment that is expected to last for multiple years, right? It's not well, we can pull this out. Like, our stuff's kind of stuck there for a while, if, you know, in most cases. So if we've got a customer that is not doing their part of maintaining it properly or is scapegoating us because of other problems they might have. I mean, I've been down that path. It's taught me a lot about which customers in the U.S. and elsewhere do you really want to work with? Because the analogy I always use there, Jim, is there's some people, some companies we work with that they can make a turd look shiny, right? I know there are a lot of customers that I have that I am blessed to have, because I know that if they were working with another product or something low tech, they would still do just as good. Like, they're just going to succeed with whatever they have, right? A Midas touch or whatever. I don't know, you know, but there's some others that are probably going to find ways to screw up most of the things they have. And it's really important on the sales end to recognize that early, right? Before you go too far, because some of those customers cost your company more money than they make you. And if we can recognize that early before you don't get too deep, your money ahead. So it's a really important piece for people in allied industry. And I think that probably applies to nutrition, genetics, pharmaceuticals, name your business there. But as a product supplier, that's a truism, I think. But the second part is the lost sale that you legitimately lost that you wanted, right? I think how you lose it is really important. I think one of the most critical things is to learn from your losses and to understand, why did we lose? I think it's really important when a customer chooses another option to go back to them, show them your wrists, right? And say, all right, hey, I accept your decision. What could I have done differently to have done a better job? Not a like, hey, can I salvage this? Not basically say like, I respect your decision, but what led you to deciding that this other option was better for you guys? That is, you learn so much more from your failures than your successes, I think. And, hopefully they're less frequent. Hopefully you have more, but you never have 1,000 batting average, right? So, you can't win the games you don't play. You gotta, I tell my sales reps that at plate appearances are what I care about, right? I don't care if you have a low batting average, but if you're at the plate a lot, that you're doing your job. Now, when you do have somebody that you lose initially, you got to try to learn from those and then either change your approach, change your product, change your strategy to hopefully win the next one. But I think if you approached it with professionalism, I think if you approach it with dignity and respect to the customer, the right customers will see that. And one analogy I've given to one system that is pretty low tech. They're not really, in the electronic, let's just say they're not really adopters of technology. One of the messages that I gave them, because they're proud of how low tech they are and they execute at a relatively high level. And so they're probably just not a good fit for us right now because we are inherently an electronic company, right? So, my message to them is, hey, I respect where you're at, but I'm going to surround you with enough success stories that you cannot ignore us. And like, hey, when you're ready to do business, hopefully we can talk. When you're ready to embrace technology, it might be 10, 15 years from now, but hopefully we'll be on your mind. Mm-hmm. And that's been hard to do because, you're like, you look at your powerhouse list or something and you're like, man, I don't have anything with these guys or these guys or these guys. That list is getting shorter for us as far as the traction we have, but there's still a few white whales out there that are not electronic adoptees yet. And I try to have the mindset of our day will come, but on the ones that you lose to another option, whether it's electronic or low tech, it's really important to learn from those and to try to figure out what could you do different next time. Because if we don't do our job really well, somebody's going to come along with a better option or a better recipe, right? And I think we shouldn't be naive to that.
As you review your wins and losses, are there any themes that seem to be lost that we're not looking at as a swine industry in the United States?
Yes. I mean, I'm getting more exposure to the global market now. I mean, my role changed from U.S. commercial director to North American, and I absorbed Mexico and Canada last year. I get exposed to the European and the Asian market somewhat too. And I do think, as you look to Europe in particular, they are being forced to learn in a high cost, high regulatory environment. They're being forced to learn how to get more juice from the orange, right? They've got limited capability for expansion. They've got more and more regulations. So they've got to figure out how to get, you got to put a high octane fuel in these race car females today to get the most out of them. And it's impressive to see what some producers in Europe can do. And in many cases, precision feeding can unlock some of those extra PSY or whatever your metric is, maybe feed savings or return on investment. And so I would say that technology adoption is faster and greater there than here in North America at this point. I think some of that is because of external forces that have forced that on them. But what we have is we've got a roadmap of what's likely to come most of the time. I mean, hopefully some things don't come, because they can make it really hard for us to do business and be competitive. But there is a bit of a roadmap for being prepared for those things and some of the lessons they've already learned, how we can implement them. I'm on a sow housing task force with National Pork Board, where we are collectively as a group looking at temporary crating scenarios for farrowing. Right? There's a lot of talk in Europe about free farrowing, or at least temporary crating, right? Turnaround crates, let's call them. They've learned a lot already, and we are trying to develop some homegrown research in U.S. facilities and U.S. environment that will hopefully give us some lines to draw in the sand when and if regulatory pressures change here in the U.S. and some state ballot initiative is going to try to put the screws to us on some new, thing that's going to make it harder for us to do business. But there's a lot we can learn from people across the pond and in other industries to do better. And there's places in this world that are frankly beating us on raising pigs. And a lot of that, I'm not a veterinarian. You're not a veterinarian. We don't need to talk too much about health today, but we are getting our butts kicked out of health, and it's making us less globally competitive. So I haven't learned how to solve that, but I would say that's the low hanging fruit for our industry, is to find an answer there. And if we do, I mean, they'll create new challenges from a supply standpoint and things. But I think there is the best analogy is that we've got. I think you've seen this. Some of these farms with these modern genetics are just cranking. I mean, the genetic progress that we've seen in the past 3 years, it seems like it is just like hit the gas pedal. It's not like we didn't have it before, but it's been leaps and bounds recently. And I think in order to reach some of those sows' potentials, having a conservative approach to how we provide feed to them will hold farms back. And there's a place for precision feeding. Finding the right place and the right value proposition it's going to be very case specific, but there is certainly a place for, there is a lot of variation in sow farms. It naturally exists, whether we're talking about feed intake and lactation or performance in gestation, fertility, whatever. But we have a lot of opportunity, I think, even back into the grow finish sector, to reduce very individual variation. And it's going to take precision feeding technologies to fully get there. The thing that we all have to remember, though, is that we still got some farms feeding with a scoop shovel. Like, that's not a one-step process, right? That's like maybe we talk about automating the feed system first. Maybe then we talk about a basic ESF. Like, I love what we can do with feed blending and multiple diets and things, but it's a bridge too far for some people. Like, you got to walk before you can run. And it's our job to not oversell some of that to the wrong people that maybe are not in a position to capitalize on. Because some of that comes back to, is there a real capacity within that production team, management team, facility to extract that value? I hope that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. We have a tendency as humans to generalize. And we say the U.S. industry is. And you just illustrated it's wide. And you've got people that have your feeders. You have people that are still feeding by hand. Are we as an industry, and going back to generalization here, why are we so accepting of our health and death loss challenges?
Oh, I preach and require here. I think we should be embarrassed about it, to be completely honest. I mean, I think the dairy industry went through this before us, and they, I think, have turned some of that around. I'm not a dairy expert, but it wasn't that long ago that having hybrid dairy cows was no go in dairy farms, and we got a lot of Hojo cows now that, hey, guess what? Crossbreeding creates a lot more resiliency, and so that was an important step for that industry. I'm sure they've done a lot of other things, and I'm sure they would still like to have lower mortality, morbidity in the dairy cow herd. But there is a level of acceptance that I think is, if you're a stockman at heart, which I hope most of us are, I think you've got to really do some soul searching to say tolerating that or being desensitized to that is not sustainable. Right now, if you're going to raise pigs, it means you're going to have dead pigs. We're not talking about unrealistic expectations, but when you still see the level of variation that exists in our industry, it shows what people are still capable of if you change that. And we did a survey of our customers last fall that I presented at the Pig Livability Conference. It was my task was to talk about what does success in pen gestation look like. We did a survey of, I think, about 38 of our sow farms. It was like 125,000 sows. And I don't think anything that we found would shock people, but the variability in sow mortality was still quite high. Like there were farms that are, sub 7-8% on a long period of time on a big farm that I think most of us would recall that there was a long time where we were there and we were considering that reasonable or acceptable, not 15, right? But one of the things that I did see, because we were asking these participants in the survey a lot of different things. One of the things that did come out of it is the ratio of sows per person. The lower mortality farms generally had less sows per person. And so bodies alone don't necessarily mean good performance. But I think in general, if you've got more people, higher quality people managing sows and getting their eyeballs on their sows more often, it should come hand in hand to be able to reduce mortality. And, one of the war paths that I'm on right now is I think we really need to change gilt development. I think raising our gilts like barrows for their entire life until we decide to stick an AI rod in them and then expecting them to have longevity in the herd, I think is a really short-sighted approach. It's an approach we've had for a long time. And we've all been complaining about GDU quality for a long time. I'm sick of it. It's time to change. We need to do some different things. It's time for a rethink. Is it all feed system related? Absolutely not. But can we do some things in feed systems that can hopefully equip these gilts to be more ready for a life in the farm? Yes, because I think it is blatantly obvious that the percentage of females leaving after their first and second parity can be at least partially attributed to how they were raised prior to breeding. And I think we need to take a serious look at investing more in that stage or continue to expect the same results. Right? Like I don't think, for example, prolapses are probably related to that, and prolapses have gotten a lot of attention and they're clearly a legitimate problem. But I think feet and leg structure in particular, if we could raise these gilts differently, more uniformly, maybe in a more controlled way, we have the potential to have a lot better skeletons under these females that are going to give them a higher likelihood of remaining in the herd until P3 or whatever we decide is our return on investment. But you're picking at a scab here for me, Jim, because I'm not a vet. Like there's a lot of these things that we're not going to change, but I do think that there is a level of tolerance in sow mortality that is, replacement rates, looking at our gilt replacement rates today, we should be disgusted by some of that. There is a level of just, hey, that's what it takes. There's enough genetic improvement that it's worth it. And I think some of that is masked by the fact that cull sows have been worth a lot in our market for a long time. And that's something that's inherently different than, let's say, a cull cow in most years. The cow side's a little different right now. Cull cows are worth a lot too, but in most years, cull cows are seen as just a byproduct. And we've gotten a lot of value out of cull sows in the U.S., and I think that's helped justify some of these replacement rates. But when they die on the farm, that hurts everybody. So that's an important delineation too about removals or culls versus sow death as well. But I'm probably not in a position to give a lot of commentary about pre-weaning mortality and wean to finish mortality, but obviously those are higher than they should be, higher than I think we need to allow them to be long-term, and it'll be interesting to see what type of solutions we can provide in the near term. But I think we are a little bit fortunate that our consumers have not raised more alarm bells about that.
I had a question lined up and you just derailed me.
Sorry.
No, it's good. We need to thank our lucky stars, and we need to pray every single night to the God above that PETA and those types of organizations haven't grabbed on to 30% mortality, because they would eat our shorts.
Yeah. I mean, they're probably not going to say any mortality is acceptable, right? I mean, at the end of the day, they're going to say we shouldn't be raising pigs in the first place. But I think if they knew how bad it really was, it would be a bigger talking point. And then we've got to have reasonable discussion about what can we really do. But I think some of it just comes back to what is your priority, right? And most of the time our priorities are governed by economics. It's one of the things though that I really, it's longevity conversations are harder economics. So ipso facto, we don't do them very often. But I struggle to really justify the level of replacement rates we have, especially in young females. And whenever I run the math, it does not take long to pay off a little extra investment if you can move the needle a few percentage points on retention rate or retention to P3. The thing that I'm still scratching my head about is like, man, if that math is that clear, why haven't we done it already? And I'm kind of back on the GDU path again, but I think we feel really good about finisher design and how to feed finishing pigs. And at the end of the day, a lot of people see growing gilts as finishers up until HNS and going into a crate. And I think it's time to challenge that mindset because it's hurt. I think it's costing us. I know it's costing us. I don't maybe know how much, but I know that there's some things we can do differently now that we have commercially available technologies and camera systems. I mean, there's a lot of tools out there that we got to change some mindsets about doing it differently. And this comes back to that whole like facilities design team versus nutrition team versus production team. Getting all those hats in the same room and agreeing to try something different is hard. I mean, I had somebody talk to me about this earlier and they basically said, Hyatt, all of your points are right, but this isn't about economics. This is a paradigm shift in how we need to be raising gilts. And it's going to take time for people to come to grips with that. And that's fine, but the time is now.
Okay. Do you think the swine industry should have taken Prop 12 as a blessing in disguise?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think it's still an attack on our industry, and it's unfounded. Mm-hmm. I mean, the scientific justification behind it, for the most part, is BS. I think we should take it as an opportunity to learn things, though, and we have. I definitely don't think we need to give ground because it's a slippery slope, and we've seen Europe not successfully defend their production practices, and look at where they're at. And so we're having these conversations about the loose farrowing. It's like, by doing research on loose farrowing, is that an admission that what we're doing today is wrong? And it's like, no, but we need to be prepared to answer those tough questions by collecting the science in a homegrown theater to if we need to change, maybe we do, maybe we need to shift, but we shouldn't just shift to whatever Europe's doing because that's where California, grab something. Like if there's good domestic research that says, hey, you don't need it. The regulations in Europe right now are for an 8x10 farrowing crate. I mean, that's over 2x what most farms are doing today. And I think most people would recognize that a 35 square foot farrowing crate isn't probably big enough for modern sows. And if they were going back and doing a new barn, they'd probably try to make it bigger. Most of them do not see the justification to go to 80 square feet. And I agree with them. So let's get some domestic research that aligns with research that's already been done to look at, hey, maybe there's a middle point or a hybrid, a compromise that achieves all goals. That's where I feel like our obligation is. And we can't just be takers of that. We need to be somewhat progressive and investigate that. So that is a balance. I think doing nothing because we don't want to show any sign of weakness, I think is a mistake. But I also don't think that we should just roll over and take animal welfare, there's a lot of things that are outside of the realistic spectrum that are going to make it too hard to be productive. And I love that juxtaposition. That's one of my favorite things about my job is working through the Prop 12 transition. I'm not saying I relished it, but it was a challenge that I think required the need of science and practical application. And there was a path through the weed. There was a path down the road to high level production with Prop 12. I got a bunch of farms that are doing awesome in Prop 12 production. But does that mean that everybody should go there? No, that's not what I'm saying. But can it be done? Absolutely. I just tell people it's a narrower path. There's a lot more pitfalls you can fall into. And so it's fun to be part of the consulting relationship to help them get there.
We like to say in agriculture, follow the science, but the scientific explanation is usually nuanced. How do we do a better job of making our message simple?
I think I don't have a quick answer for that. I don't. I think what it requires though is we have got to make sure that the conduit between the real industry and the places doing the science is strong and well linked. And the people doing that research have to understand what it's like in a conventional system. It's understandable, and it happens sometimes that in the ivory towers we lose touch of what are the real world problems. And we talked earlier about how I'm trying to minimize that within my company, that we don't, get into that same pitfall. But that happens in the research to application across the industry. So I think it's the job of allied industry, of production systems, to continue to invest in research and science that is somewhat cross-departmental, I'm not using the right word there, but it's not only through university research, but that is obviously a path. But I think making sure that we don't get into silos is key. And if we don't do that, we're going to have people that are equipped to deliver that message in a tangible, meaningful, executable way. I like to consider myself someone who can do that, but I recognize that not everybody can, or not everybody's been trained in a way that they can. And I think we need more people that can do that, because there are some things that are science that has not made it to the SLAT level. And sometimes it's not been because the science doesn't work. It's the message hasn't gotten there the right way, right? Or it's taken too long to get there. And so I think that's just a existential challenge we have to, it's back to that, knife's edge, that we're never going to solve that. That's just staying in the balance. And as we see land grant institutions maybe lose some impact, that's I think a risk for us. And there are a lot of businesses that feel like they can do all they need internally, and they don't necessarily share information very well. That's discouraging. I think that's something as an industry we got to continue to watch out for.
How do we as an industry foster that cooperation between land grants and industry?
Internships are one of the keys. I think that's something that is a need that a lot of businesses have. There's roles that those interns can play for internal research, for internal development, for evaluating young talent. But it exposes them to SLAT level or let's just say real world situations. It's not always in the barn. It might be in the feed mill or wherever. But I think having those types of commercial research opportunities with advanced education, master's, graduate level, sometimes undergraduate research, creating those pathways and collaborative opportunities with universities remains important too. And the universities need to make it not cost prohibitive for allied industries to be able to do it, because oftentimes allied industries may not have the budget to spend $50,000 for half of that to go to overhead with the university, So, but they can provide facilities, they can provide housing, they can provide, a lot of really good learning opportunities. So that there is some touch and go with that. But I think those are easy, low hanging fruit that a lot of people do, but we can consistently do more effectively. I've just had some conversations yesterday. We've been doing internships kind of on an ad hoc basis at Gestalt. I would love to get to where we have a standard program and we just, do a rinse and repeat every year, because I'd love to expand that. And we have seen value that comes out of that. I'm still working on the internal machinery to make that happen. But I think, within a lot of companies that we could all benefit from more of that. And those interns bring some outside perspective that sometimes the people that are living under a rock in their department need too. I still remember some of the feedback that I gave to some of my internship supervisors that, hopefully was meaningful to them at the time.
Well, you're talking about something that was foreign to me in my graduate program. We didn't talk about internships. And even in my undergrad, you did internships between your junior and senior year. So that's a progression of our industry. So that's good that we're talking about that. Well, Hyatt, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate your answers. You give us some deep insight into both how you work as a nutritionist in a feed equipment company, and I really like our discussion about some of the challenges we have as a pork industry as a whole. So thank you for spending some time on the patio with us.
You're welcome. I enjoy the discussion. And I think the thing that we've got to remember, though, is some of those topics we've been talking about for a while, and we're not doing enough about them. I don't think at this point it's about visibility on some of those topics. It's about, okay, what tangible steps can we take? Back to Mike Tokash on the, should we have this meeting? We got to quit talking and start doing on some of these things, and mortality maybe in particular. And so I feel like it's our responsibility as industry leaders, or as ambassadors for the industry, to make sure that we don't just tolerate. I feel like we've been talking about guilt development since I came into the industry about making changes, and I haven't seen very many big changes yet. And that's getting over 10 years ago. Like, to me, that's unacceptable. So let's start holding people accountable to make some changes in the right areas.
I love that. Some accountability to hold some people responsible. That's a great place for us to end the day.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks a lot, Hyatt, for spending time with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.